Good morning. Good morning, members of the ERCOT Board of Directors and guests. I am Paul Foster, ERCOT Board Chair. Welcome to the June 18th, 2024 Board of Directors meeting. I hereby call this meeting to order. This meeting is being webcast live to the public on ERCOT's website. Before we begin, I'd like to ask PUC Chair Thomas Gleason if he would like to call an open meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas to order.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas is hereby called to order to consider matters that have been duly posted with the Secretary of State for today, June 18th, 2024.
Thank you. Before we get going, I'd like to highlight that the antitrust admonition and security map are included with posted meeting materials. The first order of business on today's agenda is item 2, notice of public comment, if any. Today's meeting agenda was posted publicly on June 11th and provided instructions for the public for commenting in person. To date, no one has expressed an interest in commenting. Is that still the case, Chad?
That's correct. No one has officially indicated a desire to speak on any of the items on the board agenda. However, if we get to the TAC report and there are questions directed at any of the parties that have submitted comments on NPR 1224 or NOGR 245, those individuals are here to answer additional questions if necessary.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Next is agenda item 3, the consent agenda. And I'll ask Chad to provide the budget impacts of the revision requests.
Thank you, Chair. There are 12 revision requests on the consent agenda. 2 of them have budgeting impacts. NPR 1212, which is the congestion mitigation using the topology reconfigurations revision requests, has the largest impact with an implementation cost of $50,000 to $80,000 and the annual reoccurring cost of $180,000 to $220,000. This NPR also has a 1 FTE staffing impact, and NPR 1218 has a less than $20,000 O&M budget impact. Other than that, no other budgetary or staffing impacts on the consent agenda.
Okay. With that, does any board member wish to discuss or remove any item on the consent agenda?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval.
Thank you. We have a motion for approval. Do we have a second? Thank you, Julie. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes. Thank you. Next agenda item 4, our April 23rd, 2024 general session meeting minutes. There's a draft of these minutes in the meeting materials. Does anyone have any comments or wish to make a motion?
I move to approve.
Thank you, Peggy. Second. Thank you, Bill. All in favor? Any opposed? That passes. Agenda item 5 is our CEO update. And after that, we'll transition into agenda item 6, our 2024 summer outlook. And Dan Woodfin and Woody Rickerson will each have a presentation. Pablo?
Thank you, Chair Foster. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your interest and continued engagement in the important work that ERCOT continues to execute. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss expectations for this summer at a high level. We'll hear more details on that following. I'll review our reliability roadmap.
Pablo, I think we're having a webcast problem, so we may need to hold on a minute.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead and proceed. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chad. So today I'm going to briefly discuss expectations for this summer at a high level. I'll review our reliability roadmap and expectations for that over the next 18 months, focusing on our current operations, market changes, and planning reforms. And then I'm going to provide a brief update on the recently finalized EPA greenhouse gas rules and the mercury and air toxic standards rule, the MATS rule, that were just finalized. In a look at the summer months over the last 10 years, you can see that the growth in demand is pretty consistent across the board, reflecting primarily at the core economic growth in Texas, as well as you look at the system across a four-season basis from the summer perspective, you're seeing a pretty significant, a little bit higher growth during the summer period than what we've seen in some of the other seasons. It's a cumulative annual growth rate of about 2.5% to 3% over the 10-year summer evaluation period. It's a little bit higher than what we've seen across other seasons over that same period. And it's likely due to the very hot summers recently that we've just had. In 2023, that was the second hottest summer in Texas history. 2022 was the third hottest summer in Texas history. And actually, September of last year was the absolute hottest September, the first hottest September in Texas history. So we've seen some very recent high weather that has helped to boost some of the demand growth numbers that we've seen in recent years. We are prepared for this summer, and I will review some of the specific activities and facts that support that in the next couple of slides. So this is the first summer that we are using the monthly outlook for resource adequacy, we call it the MORA, which replaced the seasonal assessment of resource adequacy, the SARA report. Prior to the MORA, ERCOT had not shared a probabilistic resource adequacy view of the grid specific to each summer month. To date, we've published MORAs for June through August. And for the majority of the day in each month, ERCOT has little to no risk of entering emergency conditions. The tightest time to manage the grid throughout this summer has shifted from the peak load hours in the middle of the afternoon to the sunset hours in the evening, from 7 to 10 p.m. Central Time, as the solar generation declines. August is expected to see a higher risk for tight conditions in those evening hours, specifically in the 8 to 10 p.m. window, relative to June and July's risks. The higher temperature and the higher loads that are forecasted for August is a driver for that. Typically, the wind generation in August declines from what we see in June and July, so that's another driver. And solar generation is lower for the late afternoon, early evenings, because we start to see slightly shorter days beginning in August, moving into September. The summer weatherization attestations from market participants were due in early June, and inspections are currently underway for summer inspections. ERCOT also recently held a summer weatherization workshop for generation resources and transmission service providers. The ERCOT weatherization and inspection team, with supplemental support with contract personnel, anticipates inspecting more than 300 generation resources and 300 transmission facilities between June and September for the second year of our summer weatherization inspections. Hurricane season is officially in force right now. It's between June 1st and November 30th. The 2024 hurricane season should point for signs of a potentially very active hurricane season this summer. The ERCOT System Operations Training Team recently held our 40th Annual Operator Training Seminar and Energy Emergency Alert Load Shedding Drill. And additionally, the System Operations Team held a summer tabletop training exercise on June 3rd with market participants. As we look at the generation growth from last summer, we have seen meaningful growth in new generation resources since last summer. The graph below shows those additions to the resource mix that have taken place from October 1st, 2023 through June 1st of 2024. We have over 9 gigawatts of new solar and batteries that have come online, about 1.5 gigawatts of new wind, and a little over 150 megawatts of new gas resources. Because of the additional solar and storage resources and the forecasted summer weather conditions, the risk profile for the grid this summer compared to the last summer is about the same to slightly improved. Storage resources at scale is still a relatively new reality in ERCOT for us. As we start to see batteries saturate traditional ancillary services like regulation up and down, We expect more of them to operate in the energy market and in the longer duration ancillary services like ECRS and non-spin. And as we get more data on this type of utilization, how energy storage resources are performing, we will continue to update our risk models like the MORE report and the CDR reports with more actual performance data to better model future risk impacts from these critical resources. I wanted to share a brief update on some of the key activities that are ongoing related to driving improved reliability in the ERCOT market. These efforts cover a time period over the next 18 months, with several key milestones being achieved this summer. The approval of the draft reliability standard last week by the Public Utility Commission marked a very important milestone in this roadmap. While the draft standard is out for comment, there are two additional components to finalize. One is the cost of new entry value that is going to be used, as well as the value of lost load. Both of those are projected to be finalized by the end of the summer in order to support the Commission's finalization of the overall reliability standard. The contract for capacity that was issued to support summer conditions resulted in a very low submission. There were 3 offers in total with less than 10 megawatts of qualified demand response in those offers. Based on this result, we are planning to cancel the RFP and we'll have a notice out later this week to that effect. It is clear from the 2 recent experiences with capacity RFPs, the one that we did just for this last summer, as well as the one that we did for last winter, that we need to modify the approach for developing the next set of demand response capabilities in the ERCOT market. I remain confident that there is significant potential in both residential and commercial and industrial demand response classes, and that we need to take a more in-depth approach working with market participants to develop a demand response product that will be additive to the reliability capabilities at an ERCOT market level. We continue to work on alternatives to mitigate the risks associated with the new South Texas IROLs, including evaluating changes to the shadow price caps and working with the transmission operators on dynamic line ratings to improve the throughput on existing lines. I've described the reliability stool at ERCOT as built on supply, transmission, and demand response. The demand response study that we worked on with Texas A&M shows meaningful potential for incremental demand response in the state. Commissioner Jackson and the newly appointed Director of Energy Efficiency at the PUCT have initiated a project to evaluate a new demand response program and are soliciting input from market participants to help advance this program track. We are advancing the suite of market design components that resulted from the prior legislative session, including the design of PCM and DRRS, the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Service, and the associated cost study of the total suite of solutions that will help to inform a go-forward recommendation for a market solution that will support the energy-only competitive market while also sending the appropriate long-term price signals that will incentivize the development of long-duration dispatchable supply resources. I'd like to briefly touch on the impact of the recently approved EPA rules. In April, the Environmental Protection Agency finalized several rules that impact coal and gas units, including the Greenhouse Gas Rule and the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule. The Greenhouse Gas Rule imposes much stricter CO2 emissions limits on existing coal and on certain new gas units, limits that are based on carbon capture and sequestration technology, which remains unproven at scale on gas generation. The MATS rule significantly lowers the mercury emissions limits for lignite units and particulate matter emission limits for all coal units. Texas has joined other state groups challenging both of these rules in court. In support of the state's motion to stay the greenhouse gas rule, ERCOT provided a declaration that states that the rule will likely lead to the retirement of all coal-fired plants, that's 13,600 megawatts of total summer capacity, and constrain the development of new natural gas-fired plants, exacerbating the reliability risks given forecasted load growth and the need for dispatchable unlimited duration capacity. The timing of when these coal plants could close would be based on the effective dates of when these requirements would come into play, which begin in 2030 and beyond. ERCOT provided a similar declaration in support of the state's motion to stay the MATS rule, given the impact on coal units and especially the lignite units, which make up about 6,500 megawatts of the coal fleet. Rulings on the motions to stay are expected sometime this summer. I'm going to pause there before finishing if there's any questions on the update for our summer readiness and our summer activities, as well as on the EPA and greenhouse gas rules. Okay, thank you. Then I will go ahead and close like I always do with thanks. I'd like to acknowledge that our ERCOT held our first annual Innovation Summit on May 21st. It attracted attention and interest from literally around the globe, with more than 300 attendees in person and over 650 live streaming the event. Rapid grid transformation is shaping the future of our grid, not just in Texas, but well beyond. And ERCOT is at the forefront of these conversations. We are seeing the transformation in our operations today ahead of many other grids who are seeing it on the upcoming horizon. We had the privilege of hearing from some of the brightest minds in the industry, thought leaders, innovators, experts, and more importantly, doers who challenged us to think differently and put forth actionable ideas. Panel topics that we covered included essential reliability services, demand flexibility, energy storage, uncertainty management, transmission planning, and technology trends. The entire conference can be seen on our Innovation Summit page at ercot.com/summit. We could not have pulled off this summit without all of the keynote speakers, all of the panelists and moderators, and all of the behind-the-scenes employees that supported this effort in significant fashion. And I'd like to call out a special recognition to Venkat Tirupati for his tireless efforts to bring this concept to life, and we look forward to executing the next iteration, the second annual Innovation Summit of ERCOT, sometime next year. So with that, I will conclude my comments unless there are any questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Pablo.
Vice Chair Flores?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Pablo, thanks for the report. And I want to echo your comments about the Innovation Summit. That was amazing. I enjoyed my participation, although it was virtual. Back to the EPA page, if we can, for just a minute. This is devastating to reliability, not only in Texas, but all across the United States. And when I looked at the rulemakings that the EPA came up with, it seemed like they were using sort of an alternative fictional analysis to show that their rulemakings had no impact on reliability. Can you walk us through how they came to that? And
Yes. The analysis that EPA performs does not reflect any real-time operational risk of operating the grids in the United States. They do a very limited analysis that effectively it's like a capacity analysis. And what they do is they sum what they project the expected capacity to be available within the regions that are affected by the rule, and they compare that against the forecasted loads for those regions during those time periods. What that does not reflect is the operation reality of how that capacity performs around the clock. So that includes adding capacity for solar, even if solar is not available at night. It includes the addition of wind, even if wind is not blowing. It includes all capacity that would be installed in a region without any consideration for the around-the-clock requirements to actually serve energy 24 hours a day. It's a very thin and shallow analysis that does not reflect reliability expectations and needs, and therefore can't be leaned on in and of itself to reflect the expected performance or the risk profile of a grid post-implementation of these rules.
thank you. That was my takeaway when I read their analysis and also the analysis that was performed by other parties. They basically ignore peak load or net peak load at times when you have solar ramp. They just basically ignored it, said that's not going to happen. And that's, I think it's important for the audience of this meeting to understand that's not the real world. That's
right.
Not the Texas grid. That's not ERCOT. That's not the United States grid in any state.
We fully expect over time for older and less efficient resources to be replaced by newer, more efficient resources. That is the way that a healthy market operates. It's the way that the Texas market operated when it first went to its competitive structure. But that needs time to enable that transition to happen, especially during periods of high growth. When you're in a period of high growth, it's a uniquely different circumstance trying to manage that balance of when older, less efficient resources can come off the grid and get replaced with newer resources. And throughout all of that, you need to be adjusting the expectations around actual execution and operation of the resources that are on that grid. Texas's grid is changing rapidly. We're seeing most of the growth on our grid driven by intermittent resources and the new energy storage resources that are coming online. They have very different characteristics than the traditional older thermal dispatchable resources. So the transition is more complex, and it introduces more risk when you're losing resources of one kind, thermal dispatchable, and replacing them with resources of another kind. The EPA analysis does not bring that analysis into play when they do their risk analysis. And it's very important that we do that, and we support the analysis and provide information back to the EPA as well as to the federal government on what we expect the real impacts will be of these rules if they're completed. Thank you, Chair Foster. That concludes my remarks.
Okay. I think we have one other
Sorry.
comment from Peggy.
One additional question. Thanks for the presentation. And you may want to punt this over to Commissioner Jackson, but you referenced the important work that she's spearheading at the PUC on demand response. Can you give us an idea of the timing of that, when you think something will be, presented to PUC and then work its way back to ERCOT?
Well, we do have a group that's working on this. We're working very closely with ERCOT. As you know, the Texas A&M study is nearing completion, and so we'll be sitting down kind of working with them. But our, stretch goal is that we want to, look at the lay of the land, come up with recommendations that hopefully we can bring forth during the next legislative session.
Okay, thank you.
I'm very excited about the momentum we're building on this important pillar of the stool of reliability, and I think there's real opportunity here. Thank you, Chair Jackson. Commissioner Jackson.
Yep. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you.
And then, Dan, I think, is next.
Good morning. Supplement what Pablo has already talked about related to summer preparations and what we're expecting this summer. I'll start off with talking about the weather. Our meteorologists are thinking that this summer is going to be one of the hotter that we've had on record. Probably not as hot as last summer, where we just had lots of hot temperatures. We've actually had quite a few of the summers within the last few years that have been well above normal, and so we expect this summer to fit in with that. Although, like I said, probably not as hot as last summer. In fact, he is thinking it's more like only a 25% chance or so. And given what we've seen in June, I think that we're trending that way. From a precipitation perspective, El Nino is kind of in the process of going away. La Nina is building, although it may not be here for summer. And so that would mean that Texas as a whole typically would expect to see lower precipitation during the summer, especially the further you go inland. And I think if you see the pattern there on the lower right, you see it's wetter along the coast, drier inland. Part of that is that it's also expected to be a very active hurricane season. And of course, we've got one tropical system down in the Gulf now. I don't think they've named it Alberto yet, but it's probably going to be. We're likely to see, especially tomorrow, significant rain bands coming into Texas. And so you kind of see that pattern developing, even though these slides were put together quite some time ago. We'd expect it to continue for the rest of the summer.
Dan,
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but since you're on this point, can you explain a little bit what the ERCOT's role is in hurricane preparedness, given the unusual or amount of hurricanes that are predicted. Pablo mentioned, I believe, the training that we just did.
So-
What else is done?
So every other year, we do a hurricane preparedness. It cycles between that and a severe weather drill. And so it's really a coordination amongst the system market participants to plan for that. Our response in the event of a hurricane is to really just maintain the reliability of the system as a whole to the degree we can. Be prepared going into it. There's a series of steps that are in our procedures to prepare and give warnings ahead of time, make sure all the other market participants are prepared as well. The specific steps depend on what kind of system it's likely to be. In this case of the one, I'll just use this as an example, the one that's it probably is going to go into Mexico. Wind part is not going to be as severe here, but we're likely to get lots of flooding and or lots of rain that could lead to flooding. And so that's really the part of that. We work with the PUC through the State Operations Center and Texas Department of Emergency Management to help them know what we're seeing on the power system and then respond to anything that we need to do to coordinate with all those other entities. So from a resource adequacy perspective, Pablo already covered this, and I think Christy's going to cover this also, talking about the MORA in her presentation. But from a summary perspective to include that, we are expecting sufficient generation in most hours. However, there is higher risk, especially as we've talked about a lot, in the sunset hours after the solar generation goes away when the demand is still high on those very hot days. That's kind of our highest risk time. In general, whether we've got enough capacity or not is going to be dependent on large part on the number of outages that we have during those solar ramp down hours and the amount of wind that's blowing or not blowing during those times. And so that's kind of, as we've talked about in past seasons, that's kind of the three critical pieces to the puzzle. We have an additional piece this year that we saw last year, and it's likely to continue, which is the constraints in South Texas that may limit us from being able to use all of the available generation, in that we can't get it out of South Texas when the demand in North Texas is very high. And so there is a slightly elevated risk that's reflected in the MORA numbers that Christy will talk about already. So that's one piece of the transmission puzzle. From a transmission perspective overall, though, we don't see any major wide area reliability issues in our studies that we do to prepare for summer. We could see congestion where during periods where we've got sufficient generation, but we can't run the absolute cheapest generation at certain times, especially in areas of the Panhandle, West Texas, and the Rio Grande Valley. And really a lot of that is when the wind is blowing, being able to export all the wind and solar out of those areas. We've got the South Texas constraints that popped up last year that I mentioned earlier, that we'll continue to see those. Those are really in both directions from an area south of San Antonio, being able to export power that, if it's available during very high demand conditions, out of South Texas, and then if we have sufficient generation in the north but we're tied in the south, being able to transfer power into those areas. And so normally we manage that through our system economic dispatch. But when we get into very tight conditions where we're just kind of out of capacity and we need to use every bit of it, they may be binding. We did have several major transmission lines that were knocked out by tornadoes and other severe weather in multiple areas, West Texas, kind of the north of the DFW area, in Houston, and then in the Temple area during the spring. But we checked this morning. Most of those are back. There's still a couple that aren't, including one in the Temple area that's supposed to be back by the end of this month, but it is binding on some days. So the transmission owners have worked very hard to get most of those back in service, and we'll have them by the time we get into kind of the hottest part of summer. So batteries are still a fairly new phenomenon. We're adding new tools to be able to assess that the batteries are a little different than our normal capacity in that they have a limitation on how long they can operate as their charge is depleted. And we've put in place some new tools to prepare for summer to be able to take into account in our forward-looking assessments and also operationally when we run into where we're actually using that stated charge, to make sure that we're appropriately assessing how it's getting drawn down when those batteries may run out of stated charge. And so the upper left here is kind of our assessment that we look at for day ahead. Do we have enough capacity of different types to be able to serve the load on that day? We've added for our internal tools, and we haven't added this to the website yet, but we're thinking about it. Where there's a turquoise band, it looks green up there, on top, that is really the capacity that's coming from the batteries. And of course, that's kind of a flat area because it's assumed that capacity will be available all the time. But if we actually get into depleting it, where it's actually being used, it won't last but an hour or two, depending on the characteristics of the batteries. So when our demand line, which is the red dotted line there, gets up into that area where we're depending on we've used all the other capacity, we're depending on the batteries, it'll allow us to better assess how long are they going to last, or do we really have enough for that time period or not, in terms of the energy that they will supply. And then the bottom left tool is more looking at operating reserves when we get very tight. If we deployed those operating reserves, how long would they last? And you can see that in that blue box, it shows that if we deployed them all right now, that's how quickly the energy would be depleted. And so it's good for our operators to be able to know from a situational awareness perspective, not just that the capacity is there, that the reserves are there, but also to know how long they'll last. So it's kind of a new thing going into summer. We've also, we do this every year, talk about some of the operational rule changes that are likely to be, that will be implemented for this summer and are likely to make a change to how we operate the system. One of these is related to controlling the renewable resources that are behind a stability limit. We have to start binding on those generators to make sure that if the wind picks up, they don't go over the limit ahead of where the limit is. We've put in place a rule that will allow us to do that more efficiently and maybe be able to let more power out of those behind those constraints. That was SCR 819, and so that'll be in place for this summer. NPR 1186, as you know, you've seen that a couple of times back earlier this year, related to the management of the state of charge of batteries and keeping track of that, allowing SCED to be used to maintain that state of charge that when they're providing ancillary services, that'll be implemented. As part of the discussion of 1186, we also talked about NPR 1196, which has to do with the making sure that we're appropriately accounting for whether people are keeping their state of charge. Oh, sorry, this one's not related to state of charge. It's related to, in general, are people providing the capacity that they need to provide their ancillary services, and we'll do that more automatically in the future. And so these things and a few others here, including NPR 1224, which we're going to talk about later, that will help us be consistent and earlier in deploying ECRS, and when we release that in tight periods. all of these are changes that we'll be making that will be in place for summer. Some of them are already in place, but should help us operate the grid more reliably and efficiently during this summer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Woody to talk about the market side of things, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Dan, thanks for your presentation. What does keep you up at night thinking about the summer ahead? What do you feel are the biggest areas to watch and anticipate?
I think the primary one is just, do we have demand versus supply? Do we have enough to cover that? Which we've done much more work through the MORA and other places to probabilistically assess that. We're in my operations report, we'll talk a little bit about demand response, and we're getting to the point where if we get sufficient demand response from the large flexible loads, the crypto miners, and other folks that really provide significant demand response, we'll be okay. But that we don't have as much visibility into that as what we would like a lot of times, and so some days that's a little nerve-wracking to know, are you going to get that demand response on a particular day? Because if you get it, we've got enough. On other days, maybe we don't. So I think that's kind of the thing that's the most concerning or worrisome at this point.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
Woody?
Good morning. So I've got a quick update on summer markets and credit. So there's no board voting items here. Some of the key takeaways are, this will be the first summer we see the new multi-step operating reserve demand curve price floors. We'll see if that has an effect on the number of units that are RUC'd. During the first quarter of 2024, we see some natural gas prices converging with what we saw last year. We'll talk about that. And we'll also look at the forward energy prices and how they're trending this year versus last year. So the ORDC curve. So back in November of last year, the ORDC was modified to include a multi-step price floors. So when the online reserves are below 6,500, the price floor is $20 per megawatt hour. If it's between 65 and 7,000, it's $10. So these measures were meant to incent greater self-commitment of units, hopefully reduce the number of RUCs. To date, those floors haven't had much of an effect, but this summer, as we get into more scarce conditions, we'll see if those start coming into play more often. So any questions about the ORDC floors? Natural gas prices is a comparison. The red is the 2022 natural gas prices at the Katy Hub. And then you see 2023 and 2024 trending pretty closely together. Earlier this year, 2024 was a little bit below 2023. And we're seeing them kind of converge now to be close to the same. The 2022 prices were quite a bit higher due to some of the international problems that were going on in 2022. But those gas prices are a big driver for what the wholesale prices are. Any questions about those? And forward electricity prices. We've got a comparison here of these prices from a look from May and June looking forward, and you see that the 2024 prices are trending between 2023 and 2022. So we're a little bit higher than 2023, But I've been told since the slide was put together, that those prices have actually come down a little bit. The 2022 prices kind of correspond with what those gas prices were in 2022 as well. So looking forward, a little bit higher than last year, but maybe not as high as this graph may indicate. Any questions about those forward prices? All right. Any questions in general?
Any questions? All right. Thank you, Woody.
Thanks.
And next, agenda item 7, back to Dan. Board education and load forecasting. Both Dan and Jeff Billow are presenting this. Thank you.
Good morning, Jeff Billow. The purpose of this presentation is to give sort of an educational overview of load forecasting. If you were here 2 years ago, I gave a similar presentation. This will be a bit of a refresher for you if you were here at that time. But I do have some updates, some things that have changed that I'll be sure to highlight over the last 2 years that have changed. So we have a very talented load forecasting team that's led by Sam Morris, who's the manager of the group. They produce several different forecasts on different time horizons. The short-term load forecast is a forecast for each 5 minutes for the upcoming 2 hours. This is the forecast that is used in our security-constrained economic dispatch tool. So it's the real-time forecast that's used to dispatch the generation. We also have the midterm load forecast, which is an hourly forecast for the upcoming 168 hours. This is the forecast that is used for reliability unit commitment decisions, for risk assessment, for when we're looking at AAN, so if we're going to recall a generation that is on an outage. This is the forecast that is used for those purposes. And the majority of this presentation is going to be over covering that MTLF because that's what we're seeming to get a lot of questions about the MTLF. The other forecast that they produce is the long-term load forecast. So this is an up to 10 years, and then actually we've gone up to 30 years. We've extended that for various purposes, but this is the forecast that is used for planning purposes as well as for budget planning. So diving into the MTLF, so we have an internally developed models that we use, and we say that there are 4 models, the E, E1, E2, and E3. That's a little bit of a misnomer. It's actually one model that is a neural net model that we plug 4 different weather scenarios in to produce each of those forecasts. So it's a AI is kind of a hot topic right now, but the load forecasters have been using these AI models for well over a decade now. And what they are doing is they are feeding into these models the various weather forecast information, variables. They're also looking at what day of the week it is, past history, and they load all that into the model, let the model run, and it produces essentially 168 values for the forecast for the upcoming week. So that's the internal developed models. We also have, in our energy management system, we have a couple of models that are built into that system. I would say they're not as sophisticated as the neural net models that we're running. The E through E3 models, but they are there, and historically we've used those as sort of a backup to the internal models. But one of the lessons learned coming out of Elliott, if you remember, we had a software update. So the software platform that we used to produce those forecasts, we had a software update that changed the way the software looked at holidays, and so Elliott going into that Christmas holiday we weren't getting very good model results out of that, and so we had to go back to the EMS models. And those models, as I mentioned, they're not as sophisticated, and really we were dissatisfied with the performance of the forecasts that we were getting. And so one of the new things that we have done is we've added an external vendor forecast that we have been actually getting for about 6 months or so now. But that is sort of going live into production this month, where we'll be able to use that external vendor forecast model. And they have a little different approach. It's also an AI model, but a little different approach than the modeling, the internal developed models that we're using. So I mentioned the weather scenarios. So we have today we have 7 different weather forecasts that we can use. We have also started procuring an additional 7 weather forecasts that we can plug into the models. But those are not live yet, so we have those on site, but they're not plugged into the model quite yet. But the idea is that we can look at these. So we've got meteorologists on staff. We can look at these different weather forecasts, and we can run different weather scenarios. As I mentioned, through the E3, we can run different scenarios through those models to see So if we want to see, that GFS is projecting this weather pattern, but the Euro maybe is projecting that this front is going to move through a little earlier, then we can plug those into the models and see what the results are. We typically will bias the models to be on the high side, so we'll have at least one of those models will be the most extreme weather, and we will do what the load forecasters call the Frankenstein approach, which is we may, if we're looking at maybe the GFS has the hottest conditions, so if we're looking at a summer scenario, GFS has the hottest conditions for the Houston area, then for that area we'll use the GFS, but maybe the Euro has hottest conditions for DFW, and so we'll create a model that has sort of this, different regions will use different weather forecasts to produce the hottest, and that's just an area of conservatism where we want to make sure that if that worst case happens, that we're prepared for that. I think I've already talked through this slide already, so I'm going to skip that one. Probably the biggest change since I came and talked to you 2 years ago has been the level of demand response. And when I say demand response here, I'm talking about not ERCOT-directed demand response, but more what we would consider passive demand response on the system. 2 primary sources for that. One is price responsiveness. So as customers that are seeing those exposed to those real-time prices, and in particular the crypto mining facilities, as they see those real-time prices, then they will respond to those and they will lower their consumption. The second largest driver of demand response, and this has grown pretty significantly in the last few years, is the 4CP. So this is where certain customers, so these are larger industrial customers as well as the non-opt-in entities. This is where they can control the charges that they have for transmission, how much they pay for the transmission system. That is based on their usage during the coincident peaks on the system in the months of June through September. And so there are several participants that are very active in that, and they will respond when they think that the day is going to be one of those coincident peak days. Now, this has grown quite a bit, and this is probably something that I personally feel like people aren't talking about enough, and that has grown to be pretty significant. If you saw Dan's R&M slides yesterday on the operational update, that number is between about 5 and 6 gigawatts now total between the crypto mining response and the 4CP response. So historically, what we have seen is that maybe there's a day that's 102 degrees, and everybody knows that that's going to be the peak day, and so you'll see that response from the large customers, the large industrial customers trying to lower their 4CP charges. You'll see that, but then maybe the next day is 100 degrees, and they don't think that that's going to be a peak, and so they don't respond. And so that day actually becomes the coincident peak because the industrial customer, maybe air conditioning loads a little bit less, but the industrial customers are still using quite a bit more, and so that day actually sets. And so you kind of see this interplay in the market. Well, with that growing, that we're seeing that is more and more days where we're hitting that where there's that potential for that 4CP response, and it's growing to longer hours in the day as well. And so what we saw last summer, we had very hot August, where we had many days where we had similar temperatures. We actually saw a notable response on 14 out of the 31 days in the month, including on weekends. And that they're seeing that, at least in August of last year, that caused some behavior changes. So some participants that maybe responded in June and July were less willing to respond in the month of August. And so, we're trying to, take all that into account as we're producing a load forecast and making sure that we're, like I said, just taking that into account as we're making our assessments. So how does that play into our load forecast? So historically, we have not counted on that demand response in the load forecast. So when we put out our MTLF, that number generally doesn't include demand response that we would expect to see on the system. And part of that is because that response is not always consistent. And I mentioned, there may be days where they think it's going to be the peak and they'll respond, but other days where they don't and they don't respond, and so that behavior is not always consistent. And so if you think about our neural net model, it doesn't always pick up on that behavior very well. But as we're seeing more of this demand response, we have actually built some machine learning algorithms. So we have some models that are running in the background right now. So we have a 4CP model. We also have a crypto mining response model, several other models that we are running in the background right now. So as we make risk assessments, then we are looking at those models, but at least I'll say in 2024, we're not putting those into the MTLF. That could change in 2025 or 2026. I think there's some discussion that we need to have with stakeholders before we do that to make sure that we're all setting the right expectations. But at least in 2024, when you see a forecast, it more than likely it does not include that demand response.
Jeff, on the demand response, is virtually all the demand response, this is just entities making their own economic decisions not to consume? Or are there any market participants that are getting compensated directly for demand response commitments?
Yeah, so what I would classify as demand response, it is all economic decisions that the market is making. So whether that's to lower their 4CP charges, or if they're exposed to wholesale prices, or we even see, I didn't mention, but there's a lot of reps now that have thermostat programs that's an economic decision that they're making. I think if you were to talk to broader industry, then they may consider participation in some of our ancillary services to where loads can participate. They may, broadly speaking, may classify that as demand response. But what I'm talking about here is more of the economic decisions that market participants are making to respond.
Jeff, thanks for the presentation. This is a very dynamic, on the demand response side, the 4CP area, and you can throw crypto in with that as well. This is a very dynamic area, and that demand side is growing pretty quickly. Do you have enough data where you could try to look at retrospectively and then come up with a prospective forecast for this, for the behavior, factor in prices, heat, or weather, things like that? Do you have enough data where you could begin to model that behavior in a reasonably confident manner?
So we think that we do, and we have these. I mentioned these machine learning algorithms that are trying to model that behavior right now, and so we have those running on the side. I will say that there are some challenges with that behavior not being consistent. Sometimes, so it's sometimes you're expecting that they will respond and they don't respond, maybe as they have in the past, and so there's behavior changes that are making that challenging. But really, that's our goal right now. It's becoming such a that's 5 to 10% of our demand at peak. I think we have to be able to figure that out and be able to forecast that going forward.
Yeah, that's where I'm going with the question. It seemed like as soon as we get our arms around that, that becomes a very valuable forecasting tool since it's such an integral part of trying to balance the market. Good luck. Keep at it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Jeff, I just have just out of curiosity, you said you presented us 2 years ago. When you look at your long-term forecast, your 10-year, how much has that changed in the last 2 years? In other words,
yeah.
what you were looking at 2 years ago, how accurate would you say that is today? I know it's a moving target, but
yeah, I would say it's significantly changed, and even in the last 6 months, there's been a pretty notable change in the long-term load forecast, and that is really driven by a lot of the industrial customers. So it's the what we call industrial, but a lot of that's the data centers. I think 2 years ago, to be honest with you, I don't think that we saw the AI impact. And what that is driving in terms of new demand on the system. So we're a little bit playing catch up with that, but to answer your question, it's significantly changed.
Thank you. Other questions? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Next is agenda item 8, the Independent Market Monitor, IMM, 2023 State of the Market Report for the ERCOT electricity markets. IMM Director Jeff McDonald is here to present this item. Board members were previously provided a copy of the IMM State of the Market Report, and Mr. McDonald will walk us through the highlights. Jeff?
Hi, good morning. Directors, thank you for the opportunity to address you and walk through some of the highlights of the State of the Market Report on 2023. My name is Jeff McDonald. I'm the director of IMM. I've been here for about 3 months and started in the middle of the production of this report. So it's nice to have it behind us and able to talk about it now. So, and please feel free to interrupt as I'm going. If you have any questions, I'm happy to address them to the extent I can. So looking at energy prices, and 2023 was a little bit of an interesting year, and I know it comes up repeatedly in the report. The implementation of ECRS had a profound effect on the market. I'm not going to focus on that in this discussion, but you will see it is the focus in certain areas in the report because it had a fairly profound effect on energy price and overall cost. So having said that, you'll see in a slide or two we'll cover a little bit of that. But as far as energy prices go, we did see a reduction of about 13% in real-time energy price. And that was interesting in a sense because, one, it was a hot year, at least a hot summer, abnormally hot, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of that on load in a couple minutes. But we did see about a 13% decrease. The interesting part of it is there was a roughly 60% decrease in natural gas price in 2023. And so often, even though natural gas units aren't always the marginal unit and setting the price in wholesale electricity, they are often in most RTOs and certainly in ERCOT often enough a price-setting resource. And so if you see natural gas price decline by 60%, you'd expect to see the energy price decline, not 60%, but something closer in magnitude to that. So we did see 13%. A lot of the difference in that decline is attributable to the impact that ECRS had on the implementation of ECRS had on the energy price during mostly June through August of last year. So, but you can see on the whole throughout the year we were down to around $65 a megawatt hour for real-time energy, and so that is without a doubt an improvement over the prior year. one of the things that you can get out of this chart is we do look at it by zone to see to what extent there's you can call it a mismatch in generation and load across zones or within a zone so that power has to be transferred across zones in order to accommodate load. So we saw much greater convergence in real-time energy price across the zones this year compared to the last couple of years, and it was in fact comparable to patterns that we saw, I think before 2021. So that was interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about congestion in a moment.
Are you going to explain what you attribute that convergence to, and what the issues are around that?
I'll talk a little bit about that in the congestion slide, if that's okay. Yeah. So this chart shows the impact, our estimated impact that the implementation of ECRS had on energy price in 2023. And as you can see, it was pretty profound, but also somewhat localized to the hotter months, June, July, August, and September. So it did roughly double the real-time energy price during that period. And I know everyone's seen the estimated excess cost of that at about $12 billion. So there were, in the context of real-time energy price, there were a few things that I did want to mention. So this is just price. We spend a fair amount of time looking at the competitiveness of the market. On the whole, or in general, I would say, we've found the energy market to be competitive in 2023. We monitor very closely opportunities for and attempts to exercise both physical and economic withholding in order to benefit from market power. We found a very low frequency of opportunity in 2023 to exercise market power, both either in physical or economic withholding. Having said that, I know previously we had expressed a concern with market power and non-spin. That has been addressed through changes in voluntary mitigation plan. We also had expressed some concerns with competitiveness with respect to self-scheduling resources or self-committing resources that was directly linked to incentives in the RUC process that were undermining a generator's natural economic incentive to commit. Those have been addressed as well. So in both of those cases, I think action was taken fairly quickly to address potential competitiveness issues. One of the things we do see, and this is true not just in Texas, but in any RTO, is when system conditions get tighter, you see a lower degree of competitiveness and more opportunity to exercise market power. And we did observe that in 2023 during hotter days where supply and demand conditions were tight. And I know it's been noted before, but I'll note it again. The extent to which eligible generation is held outside of the real-time market in reserve naturally reduces the amount of supply that you will expect to see in the market, in the real-time market in reserve, and that can reduce the degree of competitiveness. And we did observe that in 2023 with the implementation of ECRS in a much larger, and I think to be fair, it wasn't just the implementation of ECRS, it was a more conservative operating posture as well, reduced the amount of supply available in the real-time market, which also reduced the degree of competitiveness. So, any questions so far? Good. So moving on to load trends. So there are 3 years represented here, and this data are broken out by zone in Texas here. And as you can see, 2023 did see higher average loads, that's the blue segment of the bar, and higher peak loads, the blue plus the red segment, across all 4 zones in 2023 compared to the prior 2 years. there is, to the extent you can extrapolate a trend from 3 years, it does appear that load is solidly trending upward. I think we saw about 3.5% increase in load in 2023. I know I'm following up some fantastic discussion on load growth in some of the prior presentations, so I won't cover that in any detail, but Texas is definitely seeing an influx of, it seems like, gas and oil production load, as well as data center and crypto mining load. So it's worth noting that 2023 we did see a new record in the report, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact number of times we broke the record in 2023, but there was a sequential breaking of the peak load record in 2023 that culminated in a new all-time peak of 25.7 gigawatts on August 10th. So looking at supply changes, and I'll relate this to another slide in a moment. We did see about 10.5 gigawatts of new supply come in. A lot of that was in renewables. About 7,600 megawatts came in through wind and solar. We did see about 1,900 megawatts come in for energy storage, and for new natural gas-fired plants, 970. And where I'm going to relate that, in fact, we can talk about this more if you'd like, but we should do so in the next slide. Oops, pardon me. Did I skip a slide? No. If it's all right with you, I'm going to jump forward because I think this slide is a little more relevant to new generation in ERCOT. So one of the things we look for, so of course there are incentives for solar and wind that aren't necessarily market-based that can result in higher incidence of new generation built in those technologies. But one of the things we look for is whether or not the market is providing enough revenue to support signals for new generation in non-subsidized technologies. So natural gas, and we typically focus on combustion turbine. So if you see here, 4 out of the last 6 years, the ERCOT energy-only market provided sufficient revenue to signal new generation. And that's true even if we take out the effect of ECRS in 2023. And while it's not shown in this chart, we estimated what a normal 2021 would have looked like without Uri. And to the extent it's possible to be accurate in that estimate, that 2021 also showed that the market produced net revenue sufficient to signal new generation. So 4 out of the last 6 years, you're seeing sufficient revenue in the market.
Jeff, when we look at ECRS by month, we see August looks anomalous to the other months, especially in 2023. If you take out August 2023 in this graph on the following page 7.
I'm sorry, did you want a different slide? You want 7?
Yeah, on 7.
Okay.
How does it reduce the crosshatch bars and the 2023 effect of ECRS?
So I agree with you. August was the most severe month. I can't in my head do that math, unfortunately. But if I were to guess, I would say it would remove probably somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the hash bar, probably 2/3.
I appreciate that comment. I think it's really important that when we have an anomalous month, we look at data with and without it so we don't get swayed by the startup month that we implemented it, because it looks like we did have some startup issues.
Yep. I appreciate the comment. Thank you. And thank you for that. I did want to focus on this chart because it does provide evidence that the ERCOT market is producing enough revenue to signal new investment. I'll link that back to the new investment chart where we saw only 970 megawatts of new natural gas-fired resources come in. And so, obviously the linkage there is some of the time it takes to go from planning to commercial operation. I'll say, having been in a couple of other RTOs, Texas is very fortunate. I think the time from planning to commercial operation is much shorter in Texas than it is in other places that I've been. Most recently in New England, it was very long. I would say 6-7 years on the short end, probably. And there was speculation that there would never be another gas-fired plant built in New England in anyone's lifetime. So different regions have different challenges. I think the shorter gestation period here to become commercial is advantageous, especially in an energy-only market where you can see a few years of signaling that new investment is profitable actually result in some new investment becoming commercial.
I have a question on that. If that was true, why then haven't we seen more natural gas generation, and why did it take legislative action to actually effectively subsidize the financing to actually get people to build new gas turbines in Texas? Because 970 megawatts is a drop in the bucket compared to the requirement.
Yeah. So I asked the same question when I got here and saw this chart and started learning a little bit about the Texas Energy Fund and some of the other programs. So I think one of the issues there is the lag time or gestation period to get a generation project to a point where it's commercial operation, and that might be more than 2 years. And another factor is you do have to see a series, as a project developer, you need to see a series of revenue in the market that would support your investment before you undertake it. As I noted, 4 out of the 6 years represented here, we do see sufficient revenue. That may or may not be enough for a new developer to pull the trigger. I would have to, and I'm sorry I don't have the number handy, but I would have to go look at the queue to see how much thermal generation is queued up, and I don't know.
Very little.
Is it?
There's a little bit, but it's less than 2,000 megawatts.
Yeah. So, that's a very good point. One of the other factors that I know from prior engagements as well is it has different names, but I call it policy risk. So in the investment world, policy risk is a big factor, especially for a large capital investment, long payoff period investments. And so it doesn't appear to me that Texas is indicating that there is a policy risk to new investment. Everything I've seen in the 3 months I've been here has been focused on ensuring that the real-time market does, or that the energy-only market does provide enough revenue to signal new investment, and then it continues to do so. So I'll be spending more time trying to find a satisfactory answer to your question. I guess, to be fair, another alternative is that our number for cone is not accurate. So, and I think the PC will be.
Yeah, if I can chime in, I'm glad John asked that question. That's the question I asked your predecessor a couple of years ago, is that this market is signaling that there ought to be new construction, but there's not any. And I asked why, and there really wasn't a good response. And so, I'm glad you volunteered that you're going to go back and look at this, because I think we need to look at the cone. Is the cone really accurate, given that you're asking people, or what we're hoping is the market will signal to investors that they can get a 30-year return on building new dispatchable generation, whether it's thermal or battery or whatever. And so I hope that we can make this analysis something that policymakers can rely upon and the market can rely upon moving forward.
Yeah, thank you.
But I would just add to all that, though, that I think my perspective and the reasons, first of all, nobody's going to try to justify a gas plant over 30 years. They're going to try to do it over 15 years, for one. Yeah. And it's got to be financeable. And the Texas market recently has not been financeable because they're not going to do a 100% equity check, right? They want to do a 40% equity check and 60% project finance. And the market, for some of the reasons even that Jeff just outlined, is just not financeable at the current moment, which is why the Texas Energy Fund is actually working, because it is financeable. Provides that.
Thank you.
I guess that's the point I was really getting at. It took the Texas Energy Fund to change this. So this sort of theoretical analysis actually doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think the cone is right. It's just that it's not financeable. And then the Texas Energy Fund was the bridge to bring the two together.
But asserting that the cone is what causes people to go do a project, I think is not accurate.
Yeah, that's the situation here is, I mean, this would imply that you're going to build it, and if it's not financeable, then it's not going to get built. And
people don't want to write a check for 100% of the
equation.
equity, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that. It's too expensive.
I think we're all saying the same thing.
But
Yes.
yeah, and also if you look at even 23, without the ECRS, you're pretty close to
Yep.
not being a good year for making decisions to invest, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, and if you look for past 5-6 years, it's fluctuating apart from 21.
Yep.
So to Rob's point, it's very difficult to make decisions on that kind of data. So the more analysis you can give us on that, I think the better we'll be off.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate it. I will. Thank you. So I do believe I skipped over congestion, and there was a question about that. So I'll cover congestion really quickly. So real-time congestion costs were down 15%. So on the surface, you might look at that and say, well, that's pretty close to the 13% that energy price was down, and so that's what I would expect. I would actually expect if congestion stayed the same and energy price moved 13%, I'd expect congestion costs to move about that as well. But congestion is extremely complicated. Congestion costs are always very complicated to describe because there's a lot of things happening. So in any one year, congestion can be exacerbated or relieved based on prolonged unit outages, based on transmission upgrades or transmission outages for upgrades. Weather, Texas, having been here 3 months, I'll say I'm very impressed with the variability of Texas weather so far. And I've only been in Austin. I understand it's very different in Dallas and Houston and so forth. So changes in weather patterns can affect congestion as well. So I think the question that was asked was, what was driving the convergence in energy prices, or conversely, what was driving the reduction in congestion between zones in Texas? And there are a couple of answers to that at a higher level, but I think what we saw mostly was probably the effect of about 6 different things happening between the 2 years. One of the drivers was that there were some upgrades in the Houston area that really reduced the level of congestion between Houston and neighboring zones. So that was one of the big factors that affected the congestion there. Beyond that, as I mentioned, there were several things. The weather patterns were different between the 2 years. Generation outages were different between the 2 years. And so it wasn't straightforward for us to narrow it down to a sort of definitive list of what reduced that congestion. And last slide, we did make 4 recommendations in the 2023 report. 2 of them, and I'm happy to address any of these if you can even read them. I'm sorry the print is so small. It looks like you all have your own devices. So the first suggestion has to do with increasing the constraint shadow prices to make more generation reachable in the real-time market to help resolve congestion. And I know, because I've had conversations with ERCOT staff, that change is being anticipated and is underway. The second recommendation that we made is modifying proxy offer curve for renewable resources that did not submit an energy offer curve. And the issue with that is the way that circumstance is being dealt with right now involves extreme prices. So a renewable resource that does not submit an offer curve is either priced at, I believe it's minus $250 a megawatt hour, or the offer price cap. And so that results in extreme pricing whenever those resources need to be reached by the real-time market in order to either meet load ramp, or resolve congestion. And we feel that there's a different offer curve that could be put in for them if they don't submit an offer curve that more closely reflects their variable costs and will result in better price formation. The third recommendation is improve procurement and deployment of ECRS, and as everyone knows, that has been taken up and is underway. From a market monitoring perspective, we disagree with the approach that's being taken, but would note that ERCOT was quick to take up that improvement and follow it through. And the fourth, improve the pricing of offer requirements of firm fuel supply service. So this fourth recommendation really gets to just requiring that firm fuel supply resources offer in at what would be something close to their variable cost and reflect firm fuel supply. So, and I can't speak to where that is, but I have had a conversation about it, so I know it's being contemplated at ERCOT. So those are the highlights of the report. It's a 200 and something page report, so there's more information in it than what I presented today. But I'm happy to answer any questions or have a discussion if anyone would like.
Thank you. I think Woody has his hand up over there.
Hey, Jeff, do you have any recommendations, or IMM have any recommendations about the bidding price batteries have? That number, it wasn't in your list. Is that something you guys are looking at?
We're actually actively studying that right now. So I don't have anything I can share with you that wouldn't involve a discussion of commercially sensitive information, but I'd be happy to talk with you offline about it. But it's something that we are looking into actively.
Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
Julie?
Jeff, we appreciate your report, and I look forward to diving in the 200 pages a little bit further. Kind of looking forward to the future when the PUC has an approved reliability standard for the ERCOT grid, how will you incorporate grid reliability into your analysis?
That's an interesting question. And I think some of the answer will depend on how the ERCOT market incorporates the reliability standards into the products that are transacted. So that would be a more explicit way for us to evaluate them. If it is simply just a reliability standard that exists on its own outside of the market, that's something that we could report on based on our assessment of installed generation, the queue, and so forth. But it's easier and more insightful, I believe, to the extent that a reliability standard, those standards are encapsulated in the market products and priced appropriately, and then we can track and report on them.
Yeah, well, we look forward to your recommendations and how they might be used operationally.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Other comments or questions? All right. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Thank you very much.
At this time, I'd like to invite Caitlin Smith, Chair of the Technical Advisory Committee, to present agenda item number 9, TAC report. There are 2 non-unanimous revision requests as voting items under the TAC report today, NPRR 1224 and NOGRR 245. After Caitlin reports on tax recommendations on NPRR 1224 and NOGR 245, R&M Committee Chair Bob Flexen will report on the R&M Committee's discussion and recommendations. Caitlin, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, or I think it's still morning. Good morning, I'm Caitlin Smith, Chair of the Technical Advisory Committee. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you. As we do at each board meeting, I'll be presenting a summary of the TAC meetings that have occurred since the April board. We had a regular May TAC meeting on May 22nd. We additionally held a TAC workshop on May 10th and additional TAC meetings on May 31st and June 7th, in particular to consider NOGR 245. We unanimously voted to recommend approval of 12 revision requests And as you stated, there were 2 revision requests with opposing votes. So there's a small typo on this slide. It's actually 14 total revision requests today instead of 15. And here's that list of the 12 unopposed revision requests and then the 2 with opposing votes that were considered at R&M yesterday. So the MPRR 1224, ECRS manual deployment triggers, and NOGR 245 inverter-based resource ride-through requirements. Here are your May and June TAC highlights. So at the May 22nd TAC meeting, we unanimously voted to endorse the Encore West Texas 345 kV infrastructure rebuild project as recommended by ERCOT. Also at the May 22nd TAC meeting, we unanimously voted to endorse the mitigated offer caps for hydro resources when we get to real-time co-optimization that came from the RTC plus batteries task force. Here, given that hydro resources operating in synchronous condenser mode are not SCED dispatchable, the mitigated offer cap would be set to the real-time system-wide offer cap. And here it also just indicates those special meetings we had to consider NOGR 245. We had that additional workshop, which was designated separately because it was a non-voting meeting. So MPRR 1224 regarding ECRS manual deployment triggers introduces a trigger that ERCOT may use to manually release ECRS from SCED dispatchable resources when the system power balance constraint is consistently violated by at least 40 megawatts for 10 consecutive minutes. This also requires, the MPRR also requires that energy offer curves for the capacity assigned to ECRS be offered at no less than $750 per megawatt hour. The original proposal for this MPRR came from an IMM recommendation to release blocks of ECRS at certain amounts of under generation. The original proposal was for a 30 megawatt threshold for that power balance constraint violation. We did consider data presented by ERCOT regarding new deployments that would have occurred if this had been implemented with the original implementation of ECRS, and days that would have had ECRS under either option, and stakeholders arrived at that 40 megawatt threshold instead of the 30. The other part of the MPRR was part of a compromise position that was voted through TAC. TAC requires a supermajority of stakeholders, so a 2/3 vote, and that included the price floor. The intention of people who voted for this price floor was to mimic the price of the ancillary service demand curve for ECRS that would be in place under real-time co-optimization and correspond to that release of 500 megawatts of ECRS that would be released here. So that 750 offer floor comes also from some ERCOT analysis that was presented to TAC's Wholesale Market Subcommittee, that the average price at which 500 megawatts of ECRS is traded off for energy under RTC is $780. That was kind of a macro level average. There were 10 opposing votes, so unanimously opposed in 2 segments, the consumer segment and the IREP segment, and then the remaining segments unanimously voted for this MPRR. And the opposition was really supportive of the earlier deployment of the chunks of ECRS, but opposition to the offer floor with the feeling that either an offer floor was entirely inappropriate or that it should be a lower number. Other numbers that were mentioned were the $250 threshold or $500. There were some comments additionally received after TAC. June 4th comments from the IMM, June 6th comments from Aspire Power Ventures, June 10th comments from joint commenters representing consumers, June 10th comments from joint commenters representing generators, June 12th comments from the IMM, June 15th comments from ERCOT. I believe those joint commenters from the consumer segment offered a $100 floor. There was a robust discussion yesterday at R&M. There is another MPRR in the TAC process. It's currently a PRS. It's MPRR 1232. and that would automatically release some amount of online ECRS, and that would sort of support having the higher price floor level. So I believe the board is looking for us to come back with that urgently. I will pause there at 1224. Or should I keep going to NOGR 245 and then you'll?
I think you can go ahead and then we'll
Okay.
invite discussion.
So NOGR 245 is the inverter-based resource ride-through requirements NOGR that we've discussed here. And thank you to the Vice Chair Colin Martin for being here in April. We have discussed this NOGR at TAC since August of 2023. We have had it as a voting item since September of 2023. We tabled it at TAC late last year for ERCOT to conduct an RFI. And then we had some discussions offline, primarily between joint commenters, in this case, Invenergy, Nextera, Southern Power, Avangrid, and Clearway in ERCOT early this year, and then had active discussions at TAC. Following the March 27th TAC meeting, ERCOT filed comments opposing that March TAC approved version, and this board remanded the NOGR back to TAC. As I've stated already, we had additional TAC meetings, 3 additional TAC meetings since the April board meeting, a workshop where we really educated ourselves with independent experts on NERC and IEEE standards. The Texas Reliability Entity came and presented to us. We had a robust discussion about modeling, and then 2 additional voting items. So I believe ERCOT supported the approval of NOGR 245 as recommended by the vote that we did end up taking on June 7th. And that new version of the NOGR reflected a date at which this applies to new resources, reflecting August 1 of this year. There was an indication of resources needed to implement standards up to maximizing their capability. And then the kind of TAC compromise here was a gray box, which just effectively made the language such that it would not be implemented for 9 months. And the gray box was related to the threshold for hardware changes. So that was the commercial reasonability issue. The gray box language contained a 40% cost threshold. And the intent of gray boxing that or delaying implementation was really to bifurcate that narrow issue out and give stakeholders more time to get to consensus there. So we are supportive of that kind of bifurcation or decoupling approach. There was 1 opposing vote in the IREP segment. And again, in this revision request, there have been comments filed since TAC. There was an opposition filed on June 10th by joint commenters that I mentioned already. And then on June 11th, 18 TAC oppositions. I believe those are all Invenergy entities. June 16th, ERCOT comments. There was a very robust discussion yesterday at R&M. Those comments are outside of the TAC process now, and the expectation is outside of the TAC process there would be discussion between or negotiations between joint commenters and ERCOT on NOGR 245, and then the board, I believe, would direct a subsequent NOGR that would go through the TAC process and return here in December. I will pause there or end there unless there are questions for me.
Okay. Any questions for Caitlin? If not, Bob, you want to?
Sure. So yes, the R&M committee yesterday did consider NPRR 1224 in addition to tax report on its recommendation. The committee heard in-person comments from ERCOT staff, the independent market monitor, Texas Industrial Energy Consumers, and Vistra. The R&M committee recommended approval of NPRR 1224 as recommended by TAC, with 1 opposing vote by Courtney Altman for OPOC. The committee encourages stakeholders to move NPRR 1232 through the stakeholder process as expeditiously as possible, since it provides for the automated release of ECRS to SCED without the need for a manual ERCOT deployment instruction. So I move to recommend approval of NPRR 1224 as recommended by TAC.
All right, thank you. Is there any further discussion? Do I have a second? Carlos? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Abstained by Courtney. So that passes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And now 245.
Okay, so the R&M committee, we also considered NOGR 245, which the board remanded to TAC in April for further consideration. And TAC recommended a revised version of the NOGR for approval in June. In addition to TAC's report on its recommendation, the committee's deliberations included in-person comments by ERCOT staff and Xterra. The R&M committee unanimously recommended the board table NOGR 245 to allow ERCOT and joint commenters and any other stakeholders to work on language that would bifurcate parts of the exemption process framework into a future board priority revision request. Further, the committee recognized that there may need to be a special R&M committee and board meetings in July to consider NOGR 245 instead of the next regular meetings in August if the parties are able to reach agreement on the bifurcation language. With that, I move to table NOGR 245.
All right.
I'll second that
requires a
motion.
vote, right? Okay. So we have a motion to table, Peggy?
Second, but I have a question after a second.
Okay.
You said that it was instructions to get it back to the board, 245. I thought I heard Courtney say December, which kind of threw me. Caitlin. Did you say it would come back in December? Did I mishear that? Must have.
So my understanding is a narrow issue regarding hardware will be bifurcated or separated or decoupled. We've used several words out of NOGR 245, and NOGR 245 would come back to you at either a special meeting in July or in August. And the negotiations on that would be sort of negotiations with joint commenters and ERCOT and not go through the TAC process. But then the issue that we are separating out with hardware would be in a board recommended or a board urgency NOGR that would ideally get back to you in December. And that is a very aggressive timeline, I think, for TAC and stakeholders on this issue.
So the things we agree upon,
Yeah.
we want to approve quickly.
Right.
And for the tougher
You
ones.
clarified
Yeah.
the December comment. Thank you.
Okay, so given that, you second the motion?
Yeah, second.
All right. Any,
And just to be clear, the motion is just to table 245.
Correct.
All the other comments from Caitlin are contingent upon us being able to bring back a version that achieves those other results.
Yes. Thank you. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstention? We good? All right. That passes. Thank you. Next, we have our committee reports. First bill will present agenda item 10, which is the Finance and Audit Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, the Finance and Audit Committee, during regular session, included only our standard recurring items. We looked at which are the normal committee briefs. We looked at the financial performance of the organization. We also reviewed the investment portfolio and its compliance with our current policies. We then finally reviewed the credit requirements of the organization and the certificates that are provided to our lending constituents. And we, as you'd expect, the company met all of its requirements in those latter two areas. Lastly, we looked at the future calendar of items to be discussed, and in August we'll be taking up the following. We'll look at our insurance, ERCOT's insurance renewals. We'll look at the commission-ordered operating budget reconciliation, which came out of the budget hearings from the PUC last year. We'll also be having a discussion with our financial auditors regarding the planning for the 2024 audit for the year ended December 31st of 2024. And we'll be receiving the results of the 2023 401k plan savings audit. And that concludes my report.
All right, and there are no voting items, so thank you. Next, Peggy Heeg will present agenda item 11, the HR&G committee report, which has 2 associated voting items. Peggy, I'll defer to you on whether you want to package these as one or as 2 or 1.
Thank you, Chairman. As you mentioned, the HR&G committee voted on 2 items in general session. First, the committee voted to recommend that the board approve amendments to the board policies and procedures. These revisions clarify the revision request process and also make some minor clarifications. We heard from staff the process they went through to get tax input. And the R&M committee also reviewed those policies, and I think they'll be recommending approval. So we recommend the board approve the revised policies. Second, the committee voted to recommend that the board ratify Keith Collins as the new Vice President of Operations of ERCOT, and we're very excited to have him on board. So I'm going to combine those 2 and move to recommend that the board approve these 2 items as recommended by the Human Resources and Governance Committee.
All right, thank you. Do we have a second? John? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, both those motions pass.
Okay. The committee also discussed a few other items that I'll just mention for the board's awareness. We received a Human Resources Operations report from Morris Back. The Human Resources Group has been quite active. They've added 44 employees years to date. The good news is the attrition rates that were, negative post-URI, they have appeared to continue to be stabilized, so that's positive. We also received a report on and discussed the board and employee conflict of interest policies and the review process. Staff went over there were no direct or conflict of interest issues disclosed. The employee disclosures, primarily the vast majority of them were just disclosing, as they should, that an employee has a relative that works for a market participant. Each of the items that were disclosed by employees were reviewed by staff. We saw the summaries and the actions taken, just in those cases, to remind employees of their confidentiality obligations. So all the disclosures that were made, which were appropriate, were mitigated. That concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. Next, Bob Flexen will present agenda item 12, the R&M committee report, which has 2 associated voting items. And again, it's up to you whether to combine those or take them separately.
Okay. Thanks. In addition to the committee's recommendations regarding the revision requests that we discussed earlier, the committee yesterday considered 2 additional voting items that are included in the materials. The committee yesterday considered revisions to its charter and recommended board approval. The revisions correspond to amendments to the board policies and procedures and clarify other committee practices. So with that, I move approval of the R&M committee charter consistent with the red lines.
All right. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Courtney. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The Encore West Texas Infrastructure Rebuild Project is a Tier 1 project estimated to cost $1.12 billion to address thermal overloads and load growth in the west and far west weather zones. The project was identified as a preferred project from ERCOT's 2021 Permian Basin Load Interconnection Study. It completed RPG review, was assessed by ERCOT staff, and received unanimous endorsement by TAC and by the R&M Committee. So with that, I move to endorse the Encore West Texas 345 kV Infrastructure Rebuild RPG project based on NERC and ERCOT reliability planning criteria.
Second.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Yep.
So that passes.
So additional standing briefs to the committee yesterday included the following. ERCOT staff filed a revision request to implement dispatchable reliability and reserve service as a new standalone ancillary service. The NPRR and dispatchable generation will be key topics of stakeholder discussion this summer. 2 resources in the aggregate distributed energy resources pilot project were successfully qualified to provide ECRS and begun participating in the ECRS market in May 2024. RTC plus B is maintaining momentum and developing software. Open policy discussions include the shape of ancillary services demand curves. For future agenda items, staff continues to report on ERCOT's working with the PUC to make progress on the reliability standard and added future agenda items for large transmission studies. And with that, that concludes my report.
All right. Thank you, Bob. And next, John Swainson will present agenda item 13, which is the TNS committee report. To my knowledge, there are no voting items.
There are none, Mr. Chairman. TNS committee met yesterday in both general and executive session. This is the general session update. Pursuant to the committee's request for presentations on emerging grid technologies, we invited a guest, Dr. Ben Kropowski from the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado, to present an introduction to grid-forming inverters. He explained the difference between grid-forming and grid-following inverters and why it's important to the reliability of the system. He also described how grid-forming inverter-based resources, especially when used in combination with battery storage, can improve frequency stability even as more wind and solar power comes online. Staff then presented the following committee briefs: an update, as we do on all meetings, on the technical projects and technology update. JP gave us an update on the market management system migration to Linux that went live in May, which has resulted in a 40% increase in the performance of the system. He also reported on the ERCOT Innovation Summit that you've heard lots about in this session. We asked to see some more targeted feedback from the attendees and talked about ways to expand and improve the program for next year. JP also reported on the Congestion Rights Review Performance Mitigation and Improvement Project, which resulted in a significant reduction in the duration of the processing of CRR auctions by at least a factor of 2, and in some cases more than that. We also had an update on the RTC co-optimization update and looked at the project plan, and I'm pleased to report that the project is on budget and on time and looks like it's making good progress. And that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. The last item before we move into executive session is agenda item 14, other business. Does anybody on the board have any other business? I do have one item I want to bring before you. This will be my last meeting as chairman of the ERCOT board and as a member. I've decided to step down effective at the end of the day tomorrow. It had been my intention to leave the board at the end of my term this fall, but after thinking about it the last few weeks, it became clear to me it'd be much more beneficial to the board and to ERCOT for this transition to happen sooner rather than later. Until a new chairman is selected, Vice Chair Bill Flores will serve as interim chair. ERCOT has a tremendous amount of work to do in the last half of 2024, leading into a legislative session beginning in January. And the board has a lot of work to do shaping and supporting these efforts. Having a new board chair and a new board member in place as soon as possible and well in advance of legislative session is what would be best for ERCOT. This is the discussion I had last week with the governor, and he concurred. I do want to say a few words about ERCOT. When I took this job, I had only a very high-level understanding of the grid and the market. What I've come to learn in my tenure as ERCOT chair is that this is the most dynamic, innovative, adaptive, and forward-looking electric grid and competitive market in the world. Texas and ERCOT are at the forefront in the global energy transformation that is currently taking place right now. And frankly, I think we're handling it better than just about anybody else. And I've never known a more dedicated, professional, and intelligent group of people than what I've seen here at ERCOT. The people who choose to serve here are not only the absolute best in their fields, but they're here for the right reasons. Everyone I've met at ERCOT wants to solve problems, not for profits or to boost a stock price, but because it's the right thing to do for Texas. As I leave this post, I truly believe that ERCOT is headed in the right direction with the right people in leadership and poised to lead the world through the energy transformation that we're in the middle of. I'd like to express my gratitude to the governor and legislative leadership, to Chair Gleason and the PUCT members, my fellow board members, Pablo and the whole ERCOT team, and the market participants for allowing me to serve you these last few years. Thank you. And with that, the board will adjourn general session.
Mr. Chairman, before we adjourn, if I can chime in on, at least on my own behalf, and I'm pretty sure the rest of our fellow board members feel the same, as you came into this position 32 months ago at a critical time for the state and for ERCOT, and so I think the state of Texas owes you a great deal of gratitude for what you've done and working with the ERCOT team and with your fellow board members to reposition, to rebuild ERCOT and reposition what was already a great organization, and get it to the forefront in all the areas that you spoke of in your comments. So, well done, Paul Foster.
Thank you. At this time, the board will adjourn general session and convene in executive session. No voting items are anticipated during executive session, so general session will not reconvene after the conclusion of the executive session. So general session is now adjourned, and the webcast will be concluded. And we'll take a short break before we start executive session. Chairman Gleason.
This meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas is hereby adjourned.